You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello and welcome to Lockdown, hosted by Steve Bomford with Mike Davis-Marks. Our armed forces operate in challenging environments. Week by week, we'll explore what we can learn from their experiences.
Series 2, Steve, that's really exciting. Tell me about it.
It is, and we are very delighted by that. We proposed to the Royal Navy, Royal Marines charity about running season 2 based on everything we'd learned over the last 6 months or so, and they rather kindly agreed to support us. And so as a reflection of that, we thought, kind of what better guest to go back to than Adrian to see what he had to say about the last 6 months. Not of our podcast, I hasten to add, the last 6 months more broadly.
But Adrian was your very first interviewee for Series 1, wasn't he?
Indeed he was, yes.
That was a really good interview, actually. It really kicked off the whole of the first series, and it will kick off Series 2. I really like Royal Navy Royal Marines charity. I think they're a brilliant charity, and Adrian is obviously quite an inspirational figure at the helm at the moment.
Yes, I think we're about to hear that as well. I think he's quite interested in sort of challenging the norms and the status quo in a positive way, I think.
Looking forward to hearing it, Steve.
So, Adrian, I'd like to thank you for coming on the podcast for a second time, and I would like to thank the RNRMC for funding Season 2 as well. And before we kind of get into the questions, I had to check in my calendar to see when we last spoke. In terms of the podcast, when we did the interview, and that was on the 21st of April. Now, I don't know about you, that seems to me like a long time ago. How's it been for you?
I think you're right. It's a long time ago, and I am amazed that it was the 21st of April. I remember doing it, and I remember that well, but trying to place it in the sort of continuum of everything that's gone on is really difficult, actually. And I think these last 6 months have been really hard. And I think that it's brought home all sorts of lessons and is still bringing home and will continue to bring home all sorts of lessons for quite some time. I've no doubt about that at all. But it's also revealed the scale of some of the challenges that we all face moving forward. And I think some of that actually is quite eye-watering.
We've developed a little bit of a saying in terms of what working life has become, and that's kind of make plans, remake plans, repeat. That seems to be the new sort of cycle of things, which can be quite frustrating, especially when obviously we're in such a, shall we say, a dynamic situation, i.e. everything's changing a lot. So really down to business, what would you say the key lessons have been for the RNRMC and your beneficiaries since lockdown?
I'm going to start with something that is going to sound a little bit impersonal. It's not meant to, because it's very important. But I think one of the things that has really come home to me is how important our financial reserves are. When I look back over my 10 years, whatever, in the charity world, the amount of times that I've seen articles decrying reserves, too big, whatever, not being used, and never really being given the opportunity to explain it from the charities side, because journalists write these articles, publish them, they don't bother to speak to us, and then move on to something else. And actually the work that we've done around our reserves and knowing how much we needed and how much we could start to bear down on them has proved really important. And that means we are in a position where we can quite happily run deficit budgets for a period of time, a not inconsiderable period of time, to ensure that we can look after our beneficiaries. If we had taken fright at what some of the stuff that was written, we could have got ourselves in a position where we were spending unnecessarily for a start, and we weren't prepared for that rainy day. We were prepared, thank goodness, for that rainy day. And I'm speaking to you now as I'm struggling with next year's budget. Our financial year is calendar. So I'm doing all the detail on that. And the level of deficit that I'm proposing to the board this year is pretty eye-watering. And in fact, directly after this, I've got a meeting with our subcommittee chairs to sort of go through some of that pain to see what it's really like. But we're in a position to do that. And I think that then ties into the sort of people bit. And this is where it's very important. Charities in this world we now face need to be flexible and agile. And for that, you need the right resources. And it's not just money, it's people, it's whatever else. But we need to be in a position where we can do things. And it's funny that you just spoke about planning ahead, replanning, and all that sort of thing. Actually, because it comes to the heart of what we try and do, which is work out how to preempt stuff, how to prevent stuff, as opposed to just reacting about stuff. And I think that is really important in everything, because we can see some of the effects of the last 6, 7, 8 months, whatever it is felt very palpably very early. That is economic, financial, people's pockets. Loneliness, that has been highlighted. What a scourge. The fact that some areas of society are sort of left behind, the inequalities that have emerged, which are really quite stark, actually. We've known about it, we haven't seen it in this way. And also where the pressure points are. Yeah, and I take the emergency services as a classic example of where they are. And so when you look at all of this, trying to map your way through is, you've got resources, you've got money or whatever. How do you move in a way that will allow you to keep your beneficiaries in the right place, as opposed to reacting when it's either the crisis breaks or actually the crisis has got really bad. And that's what we're trying to do in all of this.
Wow, I could take some lessons off you, I think. I would love this. I love this idea of being able to sort of be ready for what is coming when you kind of don't know what is coming. But I do agree with you very much about the scourge of loneliness. It's a terrible, terrible thing, isn't it? And it's technology has really been quite a positive experience, and we've talked about this before, but I think there's still our experience of working with the wider military community is there is still a big knowledge gap and a skills gap, and perhaps more importantly, a confidence gap around using technology.
I think that's right. And I think for some people using technology is quite challenging. And technology doesn't replace that human piece that we need. When you're talking to somebody and you can see them sort of visibly moved, sometimes an arm on a shoulder, little things like that, picking up the cues and hints from people. Yeah, because whilst, see the face, and I can see your face now and everything like that, and I get cues and hints from that, but it's in 2 dimensions. It's not the same thing. We've inducted a number of new trustees, a number of members of staff, but they haven't been in the same room as everybody else. And I think those sorts of things are difficult. But when you come to the loneliness, a phone call, a video call, really, really good, really, really powerful. But actually, I think we all need the human interaction. And we are doing an awful lot of work on that. We are partnering with a number of national organisations. We are using yet more technology in that, for which I make no excuses, to try and find ways to bring people together, to form virtual communities and do things differently. One of the ones we're looking at is a thing called Sparko TV. Really, really quite interesting. I think you've had a bit of insight. Ian Millans, certainly from Veterans Outreach Support, has been looking at it as well through us. And I think those are the sort of things where we can do things to help people. And if we do them early enough, it isn't just trying to drag people out of loneliness, it's trying to make sure they don't get into that lonely bit beforehand as well. And this is, a large part of our work, and going to be an increasingly large part of our work, that preemptive, preventative type of piece.
Do you see any downsides to digital technology?
Yeah, I do actually. I think it gives people free range, doesn't it? It gives people it's a bit like driving a car. We can always be brave behind the windscreen, and we can always sort of curse and swear, which we wouldn't do if it was interpersonal, as it were. And I think we can see so much of that around, and the ability to spread rumor, the ability to undermine people's confidence in whatever. I mean, vaccinations is a classic example. And I think how we come to grips with the balance of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the need to actually make sure that what we're not doing is perverse, malign, it undermines society and community. And you can't do it by making rules and laws and all that sort of thing, because human beings are human beings. But trying to make sure that the standards are there and that people gravitate towards those standards because it's the right thing to do, that's very, very difficult. And I do worry that because it is so easy to say whatever you want, to do whatever you want in these areas, that we're losing that sense of social ownership and responsibility of how we interact with each other, both at individual levels and at community levels.
Yeah, it's social cohesion, isn't it? It's breaking it up in a way that I guess no one ever anticipated. But going forward, what do you think the organisations operating in the military world, not including yourselves, but others as well, need to do differently to support beneficiaries?
I think we need to better understand where the challenges are. And that's very, very difficult. And who's got responsibility for what? I think, one of the things that I've long worried about is that sort of social compact, that social contract between the state and society. And charities tend to fill gaps. And that's all right, to a degree. These things happen. But how much should we rely on charity and how much shouldn't we? And I think that in the military charity world, by the nature of military, people have a huge enthusiasm to sort things out, to get it done. And that is laudable, it really is. But what was the state's role? Does the state have responsibility for things? Who's really holding the state or the local authority, whatever it is, to account first and foremost? I read a shocking figure some stage earlier this year, can't remember when, about the amount of benefit money that goes unclaimed every year. And it's a significant sum. I'm going to say it's over £1 billion. Somebody's going to tell me I'm wrong. It doesn't matter. I just remember it's a significant sum. And you go, why does it go unclaimed? It's not because people can't be bothered to claim it. It's probably because they don't know about it. And so I think that we need to be, within the charity sector and certainly in the military charity sector, we need to be thinking about these things and making sure that we are really holding people to account. We are really holding the state to account. And when they say they're going to deliver X, Y, or Z, it happens. I think, and I take my hat off to the NHS. The NHS got a lot of batterings around mental health and all those sorts of things, and actually is striving to fulfill its responsibilities with reference to veterans in a whole lot of areas. And I think if people take the time to look at what the NHS is doing, it really is quite interesting and is where the state is stepping forward.
Gosh, there's a lot to think about there, isn't there? So you're also a trustee of COBSIO, I believe. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, yes, that's right. And I'm on the executive committee there. Yeah.
Do these kind of conversations come up around these sort of things in environments like that? Or you can take the fifth if you like, to use the American vernacular.
No. They do. Not at the sort of formal gatherings, as it were, so much, although we do a lot of work around the Armed Forces Covenant, which is part of the mechanism for holding government to account. But these conversations go on a lot. So I meet with the other single service charities. I meet with some of the other big providers in sort of separate cabals, as it were, informal groupings. And a lot of that is about the challenges we face day to day, but B, sort of the future as well. So these are conversations that are going on. The trouble is quite often the conclusion is, whoa, that's a big subject, and how do we start to bite into that? At the same time, when a lot of charities are having to reprioritize, restructure, and worry about what the future looks like.
Challenging times, which kind of takes me on to it. So this question came from Rachel. She's a qualified counsellor, and she receives I'm going to call it a trade magazine, but it's something like Therapy Today. And I thought it was quite an interesting question, but I'm going to read this. It's fair to say that COVID has highlighted many challenges, which we've kind of talked about within society as a whole. Will we retain this time as a bad memory, especially with obviously impending vaccines, fingers crossed, touch wood, or will we just go back to the way it was? What do you think is going to happen? I mean, that's a bit of a crystal ball for you, but I would love to hear what you have to say.
Okay. So I'm a bit of an idealist at heart, right? So let's be there to start. I think this has been, yes, something that if we just look at as a bad memory, we will not actually make the best use of it. Sometimes when you go through horrible periods in your life, actually they teach you something, they set you on a different course, they show you what you value, what you don't need, all those sorts of things. And I think that if we just treat it as a bad memory, put it in a box, chuck it on the shelf and go, oh, thank goodness that's over, we're letting ourselves down. I am an idealist. I look at the creation of the welfare state. I look at the National Health Service. I look at education, and a lot of that obviously came out of sort of changes made during the Second World War and planning for peace. And go, yeah, we haven't been through that, but we're going through something very significant. It is revealing things like the inequalities that we see around us, the regional variations, as well as just the sort of economic differences, all those sorts of things. And have we got the ability as a society, have we got the political will and politicians who really want to get to grips with this, to go, actually, we shouldn't just accept this as it is. We've highlighted, our experience has shown us some really valuable things, and it's taken this experience to ram them home, I think. They've always been there, and, I suppose we just sort of ignore and gloss over. And actually go, no, we've got to do something about this. We've got to, have a dream. We've got to find a way of getting there. Might not ever get there, but you've got to strive for things. And I just think it would be a shame. It would be a loss if we go, thank goodness the vaccine's here. I can put this horrible experience behind me and I can crack on with life as usual. Yes, a large part of me would yearns to do that. Absolutely. But another part of me goes, that's wrong. We need to tackle some of these things we need to have the drive, the ambition. We need to regard other people and say, is this right that we allow these things to be perpetuated? No. So let's do something about it. Finding a way to do that is slightly more difficult. That I accept, but that's why I don't think it should just be a bad memory.
I'm reminded of the phrase that I read somewhere, which was, let me think about this, get this right, is that politicians know exactly what to do. They just haven't figured out how to get elected afterwards.
Are you having a pop at me there, Steve?
No, absolutely not. I'm just thinking about sometimes that, 5 years and planning cycles. I mean, the NHS is a good example, isn't it? A 5-year planning cycle, an organisation on that scale, that size, it just doesn't really work, does it? And there's probably some of these issues that we're talking about are going to require planning scales of that order of magnitude. But we have an electoral system which is very much fixed in a 4/5-year planning cycle. So it's some big issues there to solve, isn't there? Big issues. I'm very much on the sort of more optimistic side of things. I like to be there, but I agree with what you're saying about it would be great if it all ended tomorrow, just like that.
Yeah, but don't forget, this country has done things, some really quite incredible things, despite the periodicity of elections and changes in direction and things like that. And it's achieved great things, and it can do that again.
Yeah.
And I think, we don't have to be, as a country, pulled one way and then pulled another way and then, diametrically opposed or anything like that. And so I think there is the wherewithal to tackle that. And I know the planning cycle doesn't quite fit, but if you've got the desire to do it within, then it will happen, I think. And a lot of brilliant people around who can make it happen. It's getting that vision right, explaining the vision, getting people buying in, and getting things moving.
Absolutely,
politicians needed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You may recall it. Just a slight change in subject now. On a lighter note, I hope. In the first episode, we talked about the importance of family. In fact, this came up in many of the podcasts that we recorded. And with family in mind, how important is Christmas going to be in whatever shape or form this Christmas will take?
I think hugely important. I think it will, I don't know, something that we talk about quite a lot here, actually. But I think that it will be, I think it's very important that families can get together this Christmas more than ever before. Not all will be able to achieve that, and that's one of those things. But I think it comes back, I think it goes all the way back to what we were talking about with loneliness, actually, that we need to find a way where people can connect properly. We need to give the opportunity, and I know that the counter arguments to allowing people to gather at Christmas, and I really understand that. I think one of the big issues we haven't mentioned is, the ability of NHS staff to keep going with the levels of work. And I still do some work with the NHS, with trauma networks, and I look at some of the people and the work that they've been doing. And how resilient can you be? I mean, if you compare it to the military, on operations will tend to go in for a sort of 6-month period or so and then rule out. And if you look at, First World War, soldiers were ruled through the front line because everybody understood you can't just keep doing it. Well, they've had to, and they will continue to. So there is that argument about, are we going to break these staff if we do it? But equally, there's this social need to gather, and you've got a time that makes sense, I think, to do it. And therefore, it will mean something. And I think it's hugely important that families have the time to gather. You can't do that for every festival. I get that. And, we've had a number of religious festivals, Eid, Diwali, whatever, where these things have not been able to be celebrated in the way that they can. And I think an opportunity to be taken is important, and we just have to hope that the consequences of that are not too dire. But the consequences of not doing it, I think, are just not worth contemplating either.
So for those out there, for your beneficiaries, for our beneficiaries out there that may struggle to meet at Christmas or struggle at Christmas more broadly, is there any support, or how could they find support through yourselves?
Well, it's a very good point, because what we've got to remember is, the Navy is still operating, come what may, and I'll start with the serving, if I might, because you've got the Navy still operating at stretch and doing all the things that it's doing. And I think for those who are separated because of service, I think it will be increasingly, will be doubly hard. And I think of those, I was talking to commanding officer of one ship that went away just before lockdown and then came back sort of after it was all over in the sort of summer, and everything had sort of passed them by in one sense, but their families without them had gone through this huge challenge. So I think the serving and the families, and I think, for everyone else in our beneficiary family, how to try and look after those. I mean, this is why we do some of the programs that we do. We do a family support program, which is now sort of well underway, mental health program, and those areas which are open. And actually, if people come to our website, rnrmc.org.uk, and have a look at those, and our website also has the details about how to get in touch with us, so that we can, talk to people to guide and to help wherever we can. Because I would like to get to a place, if we can, where we can help navigate people to what they need. That's very difficult in this world at the moment. And we're doing some work about how, when people need help, do you actually get them to the right place that they need? And this comes back to your question. I look at it as the Macmillan nurse thing, the person who's by your side, hence our sort of thing, walking through this experience with you. And this is where I want to get to, so that some of these things about how we help people who might need it, what is the help they need? Yeah, how's that delivered? How's that given? That's where we've got to do an awful lot of work. And I suppose that goes all the way back to what I was talking about at the start of this. But it also gives me to say that, you're doing this wonderful set of podcasts, and you're going to be talking to quite a range of people in this. And I think, because I really enjoyed the first set of podcasts, and I think getting the views from many different people in different walks of naval family life, I think will be very interesting, because I think that the different perceptions at different levels, different areas of responsibility, or whatever else it is, will probably teach us an awful lot. And I'll certainly be sat listening with my notebook and everything, because sometimes you hear people say things and you go, gosh, I hadn't even thought of that. That sort of passed me by or whatever. And I was having a conversation with a friend for a walk the other day, and a couple of things he said about some other stuff nothing to do with this. And I just thought, blimey, I hadn't sort of appreciated life like that, walking in somebody else's shoes. So I do think what you're doing with this series, and including so many more people differently and that sort of thing, will be fascinating. And certainly, I think we will all learn lessons from each other. So well done to you and Rachel for this, because I think that's,
Thank you. That's very good. We've also really, as we've talked about, we're very interested in talking to the organisations that you work with, because they're not all military either, are they? And they have very kind of specialist skills and do very specialist things. So I think that's quite important, that we kind of should we say, get under the skin a little bit more of, what it's like to be in other people's shoes, as you put it. I think that's a very good way of explaining it. Do you want to give us any contact details, Adrian? Because I think isn't there a telephone number as well? Am I right in thinking that? Have you got that to hand?
I haven't.
Not to worry. What we will do is I will find it and I will say it for you and I'll add it in. Don't worry. And so we can just make sure that anybody out there who is in need, who needs some support, knows who to contact, whether that's on the telephone, internet, email, however. And of course, you're also part of the bigger naval family of charities, I believe, as well, aren't you? So there are many other sources of support as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's very important. So, there are a number of naval charities, and what I'll do is I'll send you the links for all of them, if I might, because I think that would be extremely helpful. And if we can get that into part of the conversation, that would be really, or at the end, at the start, whichever way round works best, would be really helpful.
Yeah,
and
so
I can get you a little compilation.
Thank you. So what's going to be different about this podcast is that we're going to be producing a blog post that's going to go with each episode, which will have the transcription. So we can include lots more additional information that we forget to mention or think about after we've obviously finished recording. And as you know, we'll be discussing this with Mike, so I'm sure lots will come up in that conversation too.
I have no doubt about that at all.
Yeah, we don't keep the outtakes. You're safe, don't worry. But I would just like to say thank you once again for coming on the podcast. I suspect we might do another one of these in later on next year, perhaps. I think it would be good to do that, actually, to have a little chat about what we've discovered, what we've learned, see if any of those changes that we're aspiring to have actually happened as well. I think that would be great.
I think it would, but also I must thank you, the company makers, for what you're doing, because I actually do think that, and I go back to what I just said about we can all learn by listening to these, because you pick up what other people think, what other people experience, what other people look for. And I think you'll find as you go through these ones, at least I hope, that there are lessons that just sort of come out, and some of them will be obvious and we'll go, why don't we get that? Others will be more obscure. But this work, I think, will pay dividends. It's almost a bit like, dare I call it, living social history type of thing. I think is sort of what you're doing, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. It's the short story you just mentioned about being deployed before lockdown, family still in Portsmouth, say, come back from deployment 6 months later when it's all pretty much, it was summer and everybody's back to normal. That must have been a very strange experience. I'd definitely like to find out a bit more about that at some stage. Yeah, and I do think that's absolutely fascinating. And people who deploy to operations in the Gulf, those in the bombers and the nuclear deterrent and everything around them. I mean, the families. It is actually, when you see and the preparations units have to go through, ships have to go through to move anyway, isolating, quarantining, do this, do that, to then be able to do operations. Fascinating to see. And I think there'll be some very rich material out there. Yeah, I will be pursuing that with you in the not too distant future. But once again, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming on the show, and we'll speak to you again soon. I'll look forward to it, and I'll look forward to all of this podcast series as well. So, Steve, thank you very much indeed. That was a fascinating conversation, or at least I thought it was. What did you make of it, Mike? I agree. I mean, I think Adrian, he gave a really great interview the first time we did this series 1. And I think he's surpassed himself this time. It's just a brilliant raconteur and really, passionate individual that's, doing some really great things for the wider naval community. I was fascinated by it all. Yes, and I think it comes across that he really does care as well, and he's actually genuinely interested in people's circumstances and how they and the wider naval family can help. Yeah, he made a lot of really great points, but the first one
was that I think you mentioned that it was the 21st of April was when you interviewed him previously, and that just does seem like a lifetime away. What has happened since the 21st of April? Everything, the world's turned upside down. It was slightly upside down then, but what a roller coaster we've been through since then.
Yes, I really am struggling on a personal level to have any concept of time where any of this is concerned. So things that myself and Rachel have done, say, you may recall we did some interviews at the Maritime Club for our Crest project. That was in February of this year. And when I was looking at it, I thought it was nearly 2 years ago.
It's amazing, actually, isn't it? But I think, it's been an extraordinary year. It's been hugely challenging. And I think that, that stretches out time, as we've tried to navigate our way through the choppy waters that is COVID-19. For some, it's been horrendous. For others, particularly if you're a PPE manufacturer with a good contract, it's probably been quite lucrative. But for the community that we're trying to reach out to, I should think it's been very, very, very difficult indeed.
Yes, I think it's probably been a bit rubbish in some respects. And I think... I just guess you try and sort of grit your teeth and get through it when it's not actually, it's probably lasted a lot longer than people anticipated.
Yeah. And I know they're talking about, 3 vaccines potentially coming into the market quite soon, but we're not out of it yet. I mean, there's certainly light at the end of the tunnel, but what we mustn't do is be stupid between then and now when we've got enough immunity to actually make this thing go away, or go away sufficiently that some form of normality can return.
Absolutely. No unnecessary risks is my advice.
He made a couple of really interesting points. The first was that actually he talked about the importance of reserves, and he talked about the fact that the press are quite ready to jump on the amount of reserves that charities have, but actually that underplays the importance of reserves when they need them most, which is when the tough get going or the going gets tough. And he said, actually, we need to put money away for a rainy day. So when it rains, and let's face it, it's been raining metaphorically the whole of 2020, then you've got that reserve to draw upon for the people for the time you need it most.
Yes, I quite agree. The charities do come in for a lot of stick on that front. But also, I think, obviously they're going to be using their reserves, rightly so. I imagine it makes planning for the future when they've depleted their reserves in a sort of very difficult climate for fundraising. It's going to be some challenging times ahead for these charities, for sure.
Yeah. He also talked about the importance of trying to anticipate and plan for all different scenarios rather than just react to what's happening. And that's very much, I think, something that runs through the RNRMC all the time is actually let's try and prevent it happening rather than try and cure it once it's happened. I thought that was a really good point.
Yes, and I would say from our own perspective, the idea that we've been making plans, remake plans on a sort of semi-permanent loop, it is very, very challenging trying to achieve that, to actually make plans in what is a very, very fluid world.
Yeah, he talked a lot about what they were doing in order to try and, reach out to other charities, to try and work together in a collaborative way, to have a community, engagement that had, lots of different people operating together so that they could sort of start to do things which were preventative rather than curative. So I thought that was really interesting. And he talked about the loss of social ownership. We've become a Zoom generation this year. Other medias are available, but that behind that's a 2D image, and actually that loss of the 3D human to human relationship is something that actually, particularly for vulnerable communities like the ones that RNRMC are looking after, I think that's quite important.
I think it's extremely important. I mean, Rachel has been doing some workshops for residents of Agamemnon Housing, and just getting people up to speed to use the technology and having an environment in which it's okay to ask what might feel like a really silly question builds confidence in people. But they don't necessarily start out like that, or indeed they start asking questions. Could I use this to talk to the rest of my family? It might seem obvious to you or I who are familiar, but for those that aren't, it can be very, very intimidating world, the digital world.
You asked really interesting question. It does happen occasionally. I know that you ask interesting questions, but you asked a question about the role of the state versus the role of charity, and his answer was really interesting. He accepts that there's always a place for charity. There will always be gaps that need to be filled, but we need to have a grand political debate about where the balance is between charity and what the state should do. And he was quite adamant that actually we need to challenge the state, that if they should be providing services, whatever, then we need to hold them to account to do that and not let them get away with it. I thought that was a really important point, and actually something that we ought to be taking up with our MPs if we get a chance to talk to them again.
I think we should make them listen to it. Personally, I think that might be a very good idea. I do, joking aside, it's a very, very valid point, isn't it? Because the state obviously is often a source of income, but it doesn't have, as it were, boots on the ground and know what's actually going on in people's lives, unlike charities and organisations like that, community groups that do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You also asked another good question. There's two in a podcast. I'm not sure that I can cope with all these good questions coming from you.
Do I get a medal then for this? I haven't had a medal yet.
I'll give you a bar of chocolate. Will that do?
Thank you.
You look like you could need it, to be honest. No. No, the good question was actually, will this, when this is all over, eventually be just a bad memory and we go back to doing what we have always done, or will we use it as an opportunity to draw upon to make things better? And his response was instantaneous, that he really hoped that it wouldn't become a bad memory. He really hoped that, and he was worrying that we weren't going to grab the opportunity that this has presented ourselves to do things differently in the future. And there's all sorts of things that he was talking about, like tackling homelessness and and air pollution and things like that. He really felt that actually there was a chance to take a new direction here, where people become more important in the grand scheme of things, and not just numbers on spreadsheets and things like that. I'm voting for Adrian to be the next Prime Minister, if I'm honest with you.
I think we'd have to wait a few years for that, I'm afraid. But again, I think he's right in what he says, and I think it's important that we recognise that even if all these wonderful vaccines worked tomorrow and everybody was able to use them, there is still everything that's gone before. There's going to be the economic shock that we still have to deal with. There are still many fissures that have come to light in society that will need to be dealt with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was slightly flippant. I mean, I don't think Adrian should be Prime Minister. I don't think he should lower himself to that level. He's much more brilliant being the Chief Exec of the RNRMC. You said, I think, politicians know what to do, but not how to get elected afterwards. I've heard you say that before. I think that's a really good statement. It is. We are stuck in a basis where democracy, which we remember is the least worst of all the systems around, still has this major drawback about actually the need to get elected overrides often long-term, thinking and strategic planning, which is a real shame, because actually, that's what we need to do. We need to be bold and not worry about being elected.
Yes, I think one of the things that's kind of come out of the podcast is the anxiety that people feel is due to lack of certainty, what the future holds, being able to see family members, what have you. And I think that 5-year cycle breeds uncertainty. You don't know what could change with an incoming government, and I think that's a real challenge. Although I do take on board his point that we as a country built the NHS with that 5-year planning cycle, so it's not all bad.
Yeah, that's very true, but it's evolved since in quite a considerable way. And that's another topic for another podcast, I suspect. Talking about families, he mentioned the importance of the Christmas season coming up, and I really mean the holiday season rather than the religious festival, because most people do celebrate Christmas in one way or another, even if it's in a secular way, and how important it was for families to get together. And he opined that the consequences of probably not doing that might actually weigh the consequences of getting together and the potential spread of the virus for a few more months afterwards. So I thought that was good. And he also I'm on a roll here, so don't stop me. He also talked about the ship that went to sea before COVID, became an issue, and came back when it sort of dulled down a bit in the summer, and wondered what all the fuss was about. But the point he made, which was really telling, is that they might not have experienced COVID in the way that the rest of us have, but their families sure as did. And, and actually, I don't think they probably realised quite what their families have been through. So the importance of supporting the family by the charities is just as important as supporting the serviceman, woman or veteran.
Absolutely. I'm hearing you describe that again. I'm minded to think of Planet of the Apes, when, as you may recall, they went on a space journey and came back and things were very, very different. And I think that must have been not a dissimilar experience. You've obviously deployed, you're doing your job, you're obviously kept extremely busy whilst deployed at sea or wherever you are. And then to come back and find out the challenges that your family must have been through, education for children, jobs. I mean, the implications are very, very significant.
Yeah, I can remember from my childhood reading a book by Neville Shute about a submarine that went to sea and then nuclear Armageddon happened and they came back and it was quite a sad story because they came back and there was nothing to come back to. There was no life as they knew it, and actually I think it all ended in a poor way. But yes, extraordinary really. He's really pleased about the podcasts, and he made a couple of comments about how much he'd enjoyed listening to podcast 1 and how much he hoped podcast 2 would provide some important insights into the way that people were thinking, some feedback, and how we could learn off each other, which I thought was a really good point. So it looks like podcast 2, series 2, has started off on a really good note.
Yes, but you've also got to bear in mind, Mike, that means he's raised the bar for us, so we need to be mindful of that.
Well, I'm up for it. Are you?
Absolutely.
Let's look forward to the next one.
Thank you very much, Mike. Speak to you soon.
Thanks for listening. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity exists to support sailors, Marines and their families for life. If you or someone you know could do with some support, give them a call on 023 93 87 1568 or drop them an email on support@rnrmc.org.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, please subscribe.